In July of 1975, Reason magazine sat down for an interview with a man whose political future was the subject of intense speculation. As two-term Republican governor of California, he had already become a political heavyweight. His name frequently floated as a possible presidential contender. Despite his old age, he was widely viewed as being the future of the American right. At this time, the Republican Party, still wounded by the Watergate scandal, was struggling to reclaim its identity. Some within the party sought to preserve its existing coalition, favoring pragmatism over ideology, while others pushed for a more radical return to first principles. Conservatism itself was being pulled in different directions, unsure of whether its future lay in traditionalism, populism, or something else entirely. For Watergate had not only brought down a presidency, but had cast doubt on the entire political establishment. The conservative movement stood leaderless, torn between appeals for cautious moderation and cries for ideological renewal. And amidst this flux, the American public had but one question. What was American conservatism? This was precisely the question that the interview sought from his subject, who, during his time as governor, articulated his own conservative vision through the language of liberty. And the answer he gave captured this idea succinctly, distilling conservatism's essence into a single, provocative statement. I believe the very heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. This man, of course, was Ronald Reagan, and his answer wasn't merely a rhetorical flourish. It was a deliberate attempt to shape the ideological trajectory of the American right, framing American conservatism as being not merely characteristic of, but defined by its relationship to libertarianism. And yet, if one were to ask a libertarian whether they saw conservatism as the heart and soul of their own philosophy, the response would likely be far more skeptical. For while libertarianism and conservatism have often been political allies, their relationship has been anything but simple. This connection, forged in the crucible of American political history, has often been one of mutual influence, strategic alliances, and ideological tension. Unlike progressivism, which libertarians tend to view as a fundamentally opposing force and vice versa, conservatism has long been seen, both from within and outside the libertarian movement, as a kindred, if sometimes misguided, counterpart. This has led to a peculiar dynamic. From the outside, many mistakenly conflate libertarianism with a mere offshoot of the right, seeing it as little more than a brand of conservatism with a more permissive stance on social issues. But from within, the reality is far more nuanced. Over the years, this ideological interplay has given rise to distinctly conservative branches of libertarian thought, each attempting, in its own way, to reconcile the principles of liberty with the concerns of conservative philosophy. Unlike the more familiar strands of libertarianism, these conservative-leaning schools of thought embrace liberty, but not as an absolute. Instead, they seek to integrate it with other principles: order, tradition, community, and hierarchy. This video is the second part of my ongoing series exploring the major branches of contemporary libertarian thought. In this installment, we'll be taking a closer look at what I have identified to be the three conservative offshoots of libertarianism, each attempting, in its own way, to reconcile liberty with the conservative ethos. While it's not required, I highly recommend watching Part 1 first, where I outline the three mainline branches of libertarianism, as they provide important context for what we'll be discussing here and in the next video. These three conservative-leaning schools of libertarianism each reflect a different answer to the same fundamental question. Can liberty exist without order? And if not, what kind of order best preserves it? In exploring these ideological hybrids, we'll uncover how each grapples with this tension between freedom and structure, some emphasizing the need for cultural cohesion, others advocating for decentralized governance, and still others seeking to balance liberty with a natural social hierarchy. While each of these schools maintains a commitment to individual rights, they diverge in how they define and sustain the conditions necessary for liberty to flourish. By the end of this video, you'll not only have a clearer understanding of these conservative-inflected libertarian traditions, but also a deeper appreciation for the broader ideological debates that continue to shape the American right. Although not as prominent within the libertarian movement in the 21st century, libertarian conservatism, or conservatarianism for short, could very easily be considered the fourth major branch of libertarian thought in the United States today. However, It is also probably the broadest and most vaguely defined, in large part due to the significant overlap that it has with a number of other branches of libertarian thought, such as classical liberalism, minarchism, and others that will be discussed going forward. The origins of this branch can be traced back to the mid-20th century, emerging as a sort of synthesis between the principles of classical liberalism and traditional American values. On that note, it's important to mention that, for a number of decades, the terms libertarianism and conservatism were viewed as being almost synonymous with each other in the broader American sense. It was, to once again paraphrase Ronald Reagan, the heart and soul of the conservative movement throughout much of the Cold War era. Although many quote-unquote conservatarians, especially those who subscribe to the ideology today, have incorporated elements of social and religious conservatism into their ideology, the word conservatism did not necessarily have this inference back then. Use of the term conservative did not explicitly refer to the defense of Christian values at this time, as it often does today. It instead had a far more Burkean connotation, meaning that it was primarily concerned with the conservation of America's classical liberal traditions, states' rights, and the traditional interpretation of the United States Constitution as laid out by the Founding Fathers. To that end, conservatarianism could almost be described as America's equivalent to British Toryism, primarily emphasizing the preservation of American institutions and in opposition to the perceived growing radicalism in U.S. politics, in particular the lasting influence of New Deal liberalism that had taken hold in both parties. Intellectually, this libertarian conservatism could be traced back to the writings of Jewish-American philosopher Francis Meyer in the 1950s, while he was serving as an associate editor of the National Review, the leading conservative publication at the time. Meyer believed that the way forward for the American right was to establish a refined, far more robust conservative movement within the Republican Party that embraced the economic and constitutionalist elements of the old right with the principles of traditionalist conservatism, while also placing an emphasis on personal freedom. Meyer appropriately referred to this conservative libertarian synthesis as fusionism, and, while not a quote-unquote conservatarian himself, this fusionist strategy was endorsed by a number of other conservative thinkers at the time, such as William F. Buckley. By 1960, Meyer's fusionism had firmly embedded itself within the realm of Republican politics. While a number of Republican politicians came to be influenced by the precepts of conservatarianism, its most vocal advocate was Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who, despite his moderately hawkish views on foreign policy, ran on a largely fusionist platform in his 1964 bid for the White House. Although he ultimately lost to presidential incumbent Lyndon B. Johnson, who was, ironically, far more socially conservative than Goldwater, Goldwater managed to propel fusionist libertarian ideas into the mainstream, and, by the early to mid-1970s, it became the dominant ideology of the Republican Party. Fusionism saw its biggest victory in the 1979 election of Ronald Reagan, who, despite being more hawkish than the majority of fusionist politicians at the time, replaced Goldwater as its leading ideological advocate. This victory, however, would prove to be short-lived, as Reagan ultimately proved to be far less libertarian in how he governed. While he never explicitly renounced libertarianism, Reagan's tenure as president inadvertently led to a decline in fusionist conservatism. While a belief in constitutionalism and laissez-faire economics did manage to establish itself as Republican orthodoxy, Reagan's pragmatic attempts at building a far more big-tent conservative party ultimately spelled its death, thanks in particular to his welcoming of the religious right and neoconservatives into the Republican Party, who, despite wholeheartedly embracing the economic beliefs of conservatarianism, were far more restrictive on issues pertaining to civil liberties and personal freedom. This change in the ethos of the Republican Party was lamented by conservatarian old guards like Goldwater, who expressed concerns over the new direction of his party as it began to turn away from the libertarian vision of himself and folks like Meyer and Buckley. Conservative libertarianism would see a brief resurgence in the Republican Party following the presidency of George W. Bush, largely in reaction to his brand of quote-unquote compassionate conservatism, in addition to the Iraq War and the expansion of the surveillance state. The rise in the popularity of conservatarian fusionist ideas was instrumental in the creation of the Tea Party movement, which, especially in its early days, espoused a fundamentally libertarian message and launched the careers of several prominent libertarian-leaning Republican politicians. This victory, however, would soon prove to be short-lived, as the Tea Party soon came to be dominated by disaffective social conservatives and interventionists. And while some stalwarts remained dedicated to the principles of liberty, and still do to this day. By the mid-2010s, libertarianism's influence in Republican politics had been thoroughly supplanted by right-wing populism, representing a new ideological turn in the Republican Party, thanks in large part to the rise of President Donald Trump. What sets conservatarianism apart from most other forms of libertarianism is its prioritization of pragmatism over ideological purity. Rather than run as libertarians, conservatarians tend to affiliate themselves with the GOP, which they view as the most viable platform through which to advance libertarian ideas. In order to appeal to more traditionally minded social conservatives, contemporary conservatarians are far more likely to oppose things such as abortion and other socially liberal policy prescriptions, which often puts them at odds with the majority of mainline libertarians. Because of this, contemporary conservatarianism tends to have a slightly more religious bent to it. Despite this loss of influence, conservatarians continue to hold a presence in Republican politics. While the late Barry Goldwater continues to serve as conservative libertarianism's ideological paragon, its most notable champions today would be politicians like Senator Rand Paul, Utah Senator Mike Lee, and U.S. Representative Thomas Massie. However, despite its lack of prominence in Republican politics, libertarian conservatism continues to flourish in conservative intellectual circles. While often considered to be more of a classical liberal due to a slightly more permissive stance on social issues, one of the most prominent conservatarian intellectuals in recent memory was economist Walter Williams, who, like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, maintained that the Republican Party was the most viable platform through which to advance libertarian ideas. Another example of a prominent conservatarian today would be journalist George Will, who actually ended up leaving the Republican Party in 2019 due to his disagreement with the direction that it was going in. Other notable intellectual adherents to libertarian conservatism are legal scholar Richard Epstein, political scientist Charles Murray, and academic-turned-cultural commentator Jordan Peterson. It's important to point out that fusionism, though rooted in a libertarian synthesis, exists on a spectrum. The most conservative end of this spectrum is notably more restrictive on social issues, and, while in favor of some decentralization and libertarian economic policy, they are at odds with the conservatarian wing on matters pertaining to civil liberties and foreign policy. Regarding this non-libertarian wing of fusionism, names that come to mind would be politicians like former Vice President Mike Pence, retired House Speaker Paul Ryan, and Texas Senator Rafael Eduardo Cruz, all of whom are more aligned with the conservative establishment than the libertarian wing of the GOP. There are also those who skirt the line between these two poles, such as media personalities Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck, who, while by no means libertarian themselves, do express some libertarian leanings on a number of issues. That said, the libertarian side of fusionism is much smaller today than it once was. While it may no longer hold the influence it once had, fusionist conservatism's impact on Republican politics remains visible to this day, and played a significant role in the shaping of modern U.S. conservatism, particularly in the realm of economic policy and its approach to constitutional issues. And while it's difficult to say how much longer this influence will continue to persist due to the effects of right-wing populism, libertarian fusionism will forever occupy a noteworthy place in the history of 20th century American conservatism. Paleo-libertarianism arose in the early 1990s as a bold and contentious attempt to reclaim libertarianism from what its founders saw as a corrosive embrace of progressive social norms and cosmopolitan elitism. The movement was spearheaded by Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell, who believed that mainstream libertarianism had lost its radical anti-statist essence and had been co-opted by establishment influences, particularly from the Beltway and the intellectual class surrounding institutions like the Cato Institute. The term paleo-libertarianism was coined to distinguish it from mainstream or Beltway libertarianism, which had come to be increasingly synonymous with socially progressive causes and a more technocratic, econometric focus. Paleo-libertarians saw this as a betrayal of libertarianism's core mission to radically reduce state power. They favor a return to an orientation aligned with the old right of the pre-war era, grounded in the values and principles of thinkers like Albert J. Nock, Edward Peter Garrett, Robert Taft, and H.L. Mencken. These old right thinkers had been staunchly anti-interventionist, vehemently anti-statist, and unabashedly conservative, principles that paleo-libertarians seek to revive within the libertarian movement. The paleo-libertarian project took on a distinctively polemical character, driven by Rothbard's notoriously sharp wit and Rockwell's unapologetic traditionalism. For them, libertarianism was not merely an abstract economic theory, but a social philosophy rooted in real human communities, traditional values, and an unyielding opposition to state intervention in both the market and social norms. At its inception, paleo-libertarianism was fundamentally an attempt to wed radical libertarian political philosophy with conservative cultural values, something that Rothbard and Rockwell believed was essential for the success of the liberty movement. They argued that a society devoid of moral and social cohesion would inevitably fall prey to statism, as disorder would lead to public calls for government intervention. Therefore, they posited that only a culturally conservative populace could sustain a truly free and decentralized social order. One of the central tenets of paleo-libertarianism is a commitment to property rights and free market economics, as inherited from the Austrian school and the tradition of thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and Henry Hazlitt. However, unlike more mainstream libertarians, paleo-libertarians stress that economic freedom cannot be sustained without social order, and social order was predicated on an adherence to traditional moral norms. This inclination towards social conservatism distinguishes paleo-libertarians from other libertarians, who often embrace more permissive, moderate, or progressive stances on issues such as drug legalization, alternative lifestyles, and multiculturalism. Paleo-libertarians argue the liberty movement's embrace of social liberalism is self-defeating, and that it alienates the very middle American conservatives who might otherwise be natural allies against the expanding state. As they see it, the libertarian project should reject not only the state, but also the ideological machinery that props up statist policies, including the left-wing cultural hegemony entrenched in academia, the media, and public discourse. The objective of the original paleo strategy was not merely to carve out an intellectual niche, but to build a robust political and cultural coalition with paleo conservatives, figures such as Pat Buchanan and Sam Francis. This coalition would be grounded in shared values, a skepticism of military intervention, a disdain for the welfare warfare state, and a commitment to decentralized governance and cultural traditionalism. Rothbard saw Buchanan's presidential campaign as a promising vehicle for this alliance. Paleo-libertarians aimed to merge the libertarian economic agenda with Buchanan's strong cultural conservatism and anti-globalist message. They believed that by appealing to middle-class, blue-collar conservatives alienated by both major parties, they could build a formidable anti-establishment movement. The ultimate vision was that, eventually, the lines between libertarian conservatism and paleo-conservatism would wither away due to ideological cross-pollination. The hope was that, by integrating libertarian ideas into the broader paleo-conservative movement, paleo-conservatives would organically come to embrace a more Austrian approach to economic policy, abandon their protectionist stances on trade, and assume a more moderate attitude on social issues. Likewise, the libertarians would come to place a higher value on the importance of cultural conservation, nationalism, and traditional morality. This would be achieved through both a mixture of philosophical synthesis and pragmatic concessions. During its early momentum, paleo-libertarianism ultimately faltered as the internal contradictions between paleo-conservatives and paleo-libertarians became more pronounced. The division centered primarily around divergent priorities and fundamental philosophical differences regarding the role of the state in the preservation of cultural norms. The paleo-conservative wing, represented by figures like Buchanan, advocated the use of state power to enforce traditional values and curb cultural decay. This often translated into support for policies such as immigration restriction, public morality legislation, and trade protectionism. Paleo-libertarians, while socially conservative, maintained that even beneficial state interventions could pose a long-term threat to liberty, believing that social cohesion should emerge organically from communities rather than through government coercion. Moreover, while both camps shared a disdain for military interventionism and embraced nationalism, paleo-conservatives often harbored more radically nationalist sentiments that conflicted with the fundamentally individualist ethos of libertarianism. The most significant rupture occurred when Buchanan's rhetoric on nativism and economic nationalism became increasingly strident, alienating the more doctrinaire libertarians within the alliance. There was also a deeper philosophical divide on the nature of community and authority. The two most significant areas of contention concerned matters on trade and moral legislation. The libertarians found that their paleo-conservative counterparts were less than receptive to free trade and policies promoting economic globalization, refusing to budge on their support for tariffs and other protectionist measures. Likewise, many paleo-conservatives remained stalwart in their insistence that direct moral legislation was necessary to upholding a conservative social order, and these fundamental divisions ultimately led to the gradual collapse of the Paleo Alliance. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, paleo-libertarianism had largely faded from the mainstream of the libertarian movement. The collapse of the Buchanan campaigns and the rise of neoconservatism within the Republican Party left paleo-libertarians politically homeless. The libertarian movement itself became more focused on mainstream issues like drug legalization, marriage equality, and fiscal conservatism, increasingly distancing itself from the culturally conservative stances that paleo-libertarians had championed throughout the early 1990s. It should be noted that paleo-libertarianism is not defined by any one specific set of policy prescriptions, and thus should be viewed as more of an ethos as opposed to a strict theory of the state. Thus, there exists a broad range of views within paleo-libertarianism on how to approach the various issues it philosophically seeks to address. Some paleo-libertarians align more with minarchism or classical liberalism, and others with anarchism or voluntarism. Despite these varying approaches to paleo-libertarianism, paleo-libertarians tend to be united in their vision. For example, paleo-libertarians tend to agree on matters such as immigration and social issues. A state capacity paleo-libertarian will typically advocate for strict immigration laws and enforcing strong borders. On the other hand, paleo-libertarians who believe in a stateless, borderless society believe that this responsibility should rest with individual property owners and or the trustees of voluntarily organized communities. Other than Lew Rockwell, who could be considered the father of paleo-libertarianism, examples of prominent paleo-libertarian thinkers today would be writer and entrepreneur Jeffrey Tucker, Mises Institute president Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, economists Joseph Salerno and Murray Sabrin, and, though he identifies as more of a paleo-conservative, American philosopher and historian Paul Gottfried. While paleo-libertarians no longer serve as a dominant force within the broader libertarian movement, their concepts have nonetheless gone on to guide other forces within contemporary politics. Paleo-libertarian convictions, for example, played a role in influencing the neo-reactionary concepts of the so-called Dark Enlightenment, such as those espoused by philosopher Curtis Yarvin and conservative techno-libertarians like billionaire Peter Thiel and the so-called PayPal mafia of Silicon Valley. Some have also linked paleo-libertarian beliefs to the ideology of Argentinian President Javier Milei due to his populist rhetoric, anti-elitism, opposition to cultural leftism, and conservative stances on issues like abortion. Afuera! Despite this, however, Milei's views nonetheless align him more with traditional classical liberalism and philosophical anarcho-capitalism, and he continues to identify as a liberal libertarian as opposed to a conservative or a paleo-libertarian. Most notably, in the 2010s, elements of paleo-libertarianism found new life with the rise of the Trump movement and the America First agenda. Many Trump supporters shared the paleo-libertarian disdain for political correctness, globalism, and the administrative state. Notably, individuals within the Mises caucus of the Libertarian Party, such as caucus founder Michael Heiss and public figures like Dave Smith and former Libertarian Party chairwoman Angela McArdle, have spoken on themes of cultural traditionalism combined with radical libertarian politics, with some even going so far as to call on their fellow libertarians to back Trump in the 2024 presidential election on pragmatic grounds, believing that doing so would be the best means through which to achieve meaningful change and advance libertarian objectives. Thus, while these individuals may not fully embrace the paleo-libertarian label, the influence of paleo-libertarian ideas in the America First movement is nonetheless palpable. Nevertheless, there remains an inherent tension between libertarians and Trump-era populists, particularly on issues like trade and the use of state power, mirroring the divisions that ultimately led to the collapse of the paleo movement in the 90s. Although paleo-libertarians and right-wing populists both oppose the establishment, their respective visions for a post-establishment America remains divergent. The question that remains is whether libertarians today are capable of building a new coalition that balances cultural conservatism with a principled commitment to individual liberty, or whether the same contradictions that plagued the paleo movement of the 1990s are destined to resurface. Regardless of these challenges, paleo-libertarianism remains an intriguing and provocative chapter in libertarian history. Yet the enduring spirit of paleo-libertarianism, its focus on traditional values, opposition to progressive cultural hegemony, and disdain for neoconservative interventionism, continues to influence segments of the liberty movement today. Hoppian libertarianism, while often associated with the paleo-libertarian movement, is a distinct and often controversial school of thought within libertarianism. Influenced by the radical anti-statism and cultural conservatism of Murray Rothbard's later years, it was formulated by the German economist and philosopher Hans Hermann Hoppe, a prominent student of Rothbard and a key figure in the contemporary Austrian School of Economics. Hoppe's ideas are most thoroughly articulated in his seminal 2001 work, Democracy, the God That Failed, in which Hoppe critiques democratic governance as inherently unstable, exploitative, and morally corrupt. Thus, Hoppe's libertarian vision emerged as a response to what its proponents saw as the decay of modern liberal democracy and the mainstream libertarian movement's drift towards progressive social norms. While traditional anarcho-capitalism typically emphasizes civil liberties and individual sovereignty, Hoppeanism instead prioritizes communal order through voluntary association, rooted in private property rights and the freedom to discriminate. Unlike conventional libertarianism, which often embraces open and pluralistic societies, Hoppeanism is inherently exclusionist. At the heart of Hoppean theory is the concept of the covenant community, a self-governing, exclusionary social order formed through consensual contracts. Covenant communities are established on privately owned land and governed by a set of rules defined by the property owners. These rules may include stringent social and cultural standards, and membership is restricted to those who voluntarily agree to abide by them. Those who do not meet the community's criteria are either not admitted or are expelled for violating the terms. This exclusionary ethos is essential to maintaining communal integrity and preserving the cultural homogeneity deemed crucial for social stability. While other libertarian schools may view individual liberty as inviolable, even at the cost of social disruption, Hoppeanism holds that communal harmony and property defense take precedence. In this framework, freedom to discriminate, whether based on culture, morals, or other factors, is a fundamental right. The boundaries of inclusion and exclusion are determined by private contract and property ownership, not by state mandates. Hoppeanism's model of covenant communities thus allows for a wide variety of social arrangements, ranging from strict traditionalism to more liberal settings. The key principle is that each community must be built on voluntary association and private property rights, with no external imposition from the state. A central pillar of Hoppean libertarianism is argumentation ethics, an innovative justification of private property and self-ownership. Drawing on Austrian economics and Kantian ethics, Hoppe posits that the act of argumentation itself presupposes self-ownership. Engaging in rational discourse inherently involves exercising control over one's own body and intellect, and to argue against self-ownership would be a performative contradiction. This reasoning establishes self-ownership and property rights as morally indisputable, as denying them would violate the necessary conditions of debate itself. In the Hoppean framework, private property becomes not only a practical necessity for societal order, but also a logical imperative rooted in human action and discourse. Hoppe's most provocative stance is his rejection of democracy as inherently flawed and morally corrupt. In Democracy, the God That Failed, he argues that democracy leads to short-termism, resource depletion, and moral decline because it places property in the hands of transient political agents rather than stable long-term owners. Democratic leaders, beholden to fleeting public opinion in short election cycles, lack the incentive to preserve wealth and social order for future generations. By contrast, while not necessarily a monarchist himself, Hoppe views monarchy as a comparatively better system because a monarch, as a private owner of the realm, has a vested interest in its long-term prosperity. However, his ultimate preference is not monarchy per se, but anarcho-capitalism marked by decentralized, privately governed communities. These communities would function like privately owned estates, where the proprietor's interest aligns with the preservation and flourishing of the community. One of Hoppe's most intellectually ambitious contributions is his adaptation of Marxist and materialist class theory within a libertarian context. Instead of viewing class struggle as a conflict between labor and capital, Hoppe frames it as a struggle between taxpayers and tax consumers. The ruling class, politicians, bureaucrats, and their dependents, lives parasitically off the productive efforts of the ruled. This reimagining of class conflict highlights the state as the fundamental exploiter, siphoning resources from the productive class to enrich itself and maintain its power. Rather than simply being inefficient or misguided, state functions are inherently predatory and must be dismantled to liberate the productive members of society. Hoppean libertarianism's strong cultural conservatism has made it one of the most polarizing strains within libertarian thought. This is due to both a contextual misunderstanding of Hoppe's ideas by many liberal libertarians, coupled with his rejection of egalitarianism and democracy, as well as its appeals to certain more controversial elements of the right. More specifically, Hoppe's notion of covenant communities has drawn the attention of far-right figures, including some ethno-nationalists and racial nativists who view the concept as a potentially effective strategic vehicle for establishing racially homogeneous societies without the power of the state and liberal establishment. Because of this support, Hoppeanism has come to be misaligned in many mainline libertarian circles, leading to misinformed accusations being levied towards the ideology. One of the most common being that Hoppeanism is merely a form of crypto-fascism, when in reality this could not be farther from the case. The fringe right-wingers who have voiced support for Hoppeanism are not reflective of most of its adherents, and, due to their view of Hoppeanism as being merely a pragmatic vehicle, all the while rejecting its actual ethos, raises questions regarding their overall motivation, one that is categorically non-libertarian. Contrary to popular misconceptions surrounding his ideas, Hoppe himself in fact does not actually advocate for any particular cultural norm to be imposed universally. Instead, he emphasizes that freedom of association and discrimination are fundamental rights. This stance has led to significant misinterpretation, with critics often conflating Hoppe's defense of voluntary exclusion with an endorsement of specific far-right ideological agendas. Nevertheless, certain elements of Hoppeanism, namely the notion of covenant communities, have found more mainstream appeal among traditional anarcho-capitalists, minarchists, and paleo-libertarians like Tom Woods, Dave Smith, and historian Dr. David Gordon. Today, Hoppean libertarianism remains influential among a small but dedicated group of scholars and public figures who explicitly label themselves as Hoppean. Some of the most prominent advocates for Hoppean ideas include, of course, Hans Hermann Hoppe himself, economists Guido Holzmann and Jesus Huerta de Soto, anti-war activist Daniel McAdams, who serves as executive director of the Ron Paul Institute, and author and patent attorney Stefan Kinsella. These individuals and others like them continue to disseminate Hoppe's ideas, advocating for radically decentralized governance, private law societies, and an uncompromising critique of democracy. Hoppean libertarianism remains one of the most uncompromisingly principled, internally consistent, and contentious variants of libertarian thought, challenging mainstream assumptions about democracy, social inclusion, and communal governance. Its influence persists among those who see mainstream libertarianism as toothless and overtly tolerant of cultural degradation. The willingness to advocate for private discrimination and rejection of democratic norms continues to provoke intense debate within both libertarian and conservative circles. Whether one agrees with Hoppe's critiques or not, his work has undoubtedly forced libertarians to confront foundational questions about the sustainability of liberty within modern democratic states. Hence, the Hoppean challenge to the orthodoxy of liberal democratic governance remains as relevant as ever. As we've seen, fusionism, paleolibertarianism, and Hoppeanism each emerged from the same friction point, the belief that liberty, on its own, is not enough. Whether it's moral order, cultural continuity, or communal boundaries, each branch insists that some deeper framework must exist to give liberty meaning and to keep it alive. Their critics argue that in chasing this order, these variants risk compromising libertarianism's core. Their defenders counter that without such grounding, liberty collapses into chaos. And that's the paradox that lies at the heart of conservative libertarianism. It yearns for structure, but fears coercion. It reveres tradition, but distrusts power. In the end, these schools don't just offer theories. They offer warnings. They force us to ask not only how we preserve liberty, but what kind of society is truly capable of bearing its weight. And maybe that's the most valuable thing they offer. Not answers, but sharper, harder questions. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this exploration, consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. And drop a comment. What branch resonates most with you? Or do you think that liberty and conservatism are destined to remain at odds?